So the question is, when did FNaF peak? Now, I'm gonna answer this question in terms of when the game was most popular. When did everything just synchronize for Five Nights at Freddy's? The answer to this question is harder than you possibly think. You could just say it peaked when it first came out, or it peaked maybe when Security Breach came out. But the problem with FNaF is it's not actually based on statistics. It's a bit more involved than that. So first of all, I want to look at the Steam charts because this gives us an indicator on when the games themselves were most popular. Now, Steam has a great thing where you can check every single live player count, which can give us a really concrete answer on when the games themselves peaked. And interestingly, it's actually the opposite that you might be thinking. The games that are most popular are actually the new ones. Okay, let's look at FNaF 1, right? This is an indie game. It was released on Steam and it peaked at an all-time player count of 1,500. This data does signal that the game is popular, but never really reached the heights that some Steam games can reach. And interestingly, FNaF 1 didn't peak when it came out. It actually peaked in the end of 2023. This is roughly when the FNaF 1 movie came out, and is a clear sign that FNaF is actually evolving. It's not just getting redundant, it's actually getting more popular. But that's just one example. Surely this data doesn't continue, right? Well, FNaF 2 gives us a good indicator that, yep, the exact same pattern can be seen here. Although the game did peak when it came out, as FNaF 2 was a lot more hyped than the original. However, in 2023 and 2022, interestingly, the game had peaks, which is very odd for 2022 because I'm not sure if anything would have released that time. The only thing I can think of is Security Breach, but it would make more sense if the movie garnered more players. So FNaF 2 did peak when it came out, and again, we have a player count of around 1,700. FNaF 3 is when we have a little bit of a different graph. Before we had peaks coming in at 2023, but this time the peak actually, peaked when it came out. And this had an all-time player count of 3.2k. The numbers are going up, indicating that, as long as people were making content about FNaF, it was getting more popular, which did correlate to more Steam, purchases. FNaF 4 is a little bit less on the popularity scale, and I am going off Steam. There is obviously iOS, which is another whole beast in itself, and I'm assuming that the iOS purchases or the player counts are perhaps even larger than Steam, but I think Steam is an overall good pinpoint to go through this data. FNaF 4 had a player count of 1,600 and it peaked when the game came out. The next massive peak that is shown is actually a lot later. In fact, it would come in Security Breach, and this all-time player count would happen exactly when the Rune DLC released. This player count exceeded 17,000 players, which is an absolute insane amount playing at the same time. It's clear that Security Breach was by far the most popular in terms of the sales on Steam. However, this does lack iOS purchases because Security Breach is a console game, but still seeing a player count of 17,000 mixed with the videos themselves getting very popular can perhaps give the Security Breach era the title of when FNaF peaked. But I do believe this data isn't showing everything, because you can say if more players are playing, does that correlate to people considering that point of time peak? We're going to get into that a little bit later, but I'm going to quickly hop into Secret of the Mimic, which did see a peak player count of 5.4k. So it's clear that the games are getting more popular. However, the increase isn't as significant as we once thought. So where I want to pivot this conversation is in terms of the games toward the videos posted online. Because FNaF is known for its games, but also known for its absolutely insane community. And I mean that in the best possible way. So looking at the videos themselves, you can definitely tell that the early dates did absolutely bang in terms of views. And looking at FNaF 1, you can see here that this is where it popped off. The Google Trends show that the early stages of FNaF were indeed more popular. The graph does peak at around 2016, which is, I believe, when Sister Location came out. So this does change things up a little bit, because now it's clear that perhaps Sister Location was the peak of FNaF. Now, I know what you're thinking. This can't be true. But honestly, if you look back at it, Sister Location had a lot of hype, more so than I believe any other FNAF game had at the time. I mean, FNAF 3 or FNAF 4 I think were very hyped back in the day, but FNAF Sister Location was on a different level. The new suits, the just new entire area was something that a lot of players found interesting. So let's go through some other data here. It does say that Security Breach did have one of the highest in terms of search for FNAF, which makes me think that perhaps also Security Breach was another big turning point. And about this time, there was a bunch of hype for the new FNAF game, and it's very interesting that FNAF peaks tends to peak when there's a very hyped project. I mean, this is like any other series, but it's interesting to see that now we're actually seeing a massive drop off. Not as bad as we got in 2017, but we are definitely having a major drop off, especially with the release of Secret of the Mimic, which hasn't really revived the series in the way that perhaps they wanted it to. But there's a bunch of other data here. Also, the next time FNAF peaked was during the FNAF movie. So we are heading toward the second film, which is possibly going to spike this graph once again. So maybe the peak of FNAF is literally around the corner, but using this data, FNAF Sister Location seems to be when the game or the community peaked in terms of its interest. Here is a quick YouTube search, and again, very similar data, but it's interesting that apparently FNAF 3 and 4 were very popular in terms of their YouTube viewer counts. And the next time we saw this hype was during Security Breach. The graph clearly shows that Security Breach bring back that popularity that FNAF 2 had brought. And it did that and barely exceeded the hype that FNAF 2 and 3 got. So honestly, this data and information is very much pointing toward Security Breach or FNAF 2, FNAF 3 being the peak moments for FNAF. This isn't just for its popularity, but overall, if we go on the YouTube searches and the Steam searches, this is when the game's peaked in terms of the interest. So I'm actually going to say that FNAF peaked at the start during its early stages, especially in the FNAF 2 to 3 era. But seeing Security Breach, it definitely did catch a bunch more traction than it did in prior years. Personally, I think FNAF has been very consistent throughout the years, even though there's been some dry periods. I will say the UCN period was quite dry. However, honestly, it's been very consistent, and for me personally, I think the most fun I've had with FNAF was during Security Breach. As much of a broken game as it was, I definitely had the most fun playing that game. For some reason, it stuck with me. But definitely the peak was during the FNAF 2 and 3 era, which is no surprise for, I'm assuming, anyone watching. But yeah, this video kind of sounded like a news forecast. I'm pretty sorry for that, but I just wanted to make something that was a little bit more interesting than I usually do. So if you have enjoyed the video, smash a like. And if you are brand new here to the channel and never want to miss out on a future upload, then please consider subscribing as well. But anyways, until next time, take it easy and goodbye.